lecture of this academic year, and it's great to see so many people who've come here this evening. And I know it'll be a really fun, engaging, and thought-provoking lecture, so thank you. So this afternoon, it is my pleasure to honor the recipient of the Fall 2024 Award, Massimo Riva. As all of you know him, and as many of you know, he is a professor of Italian Studies, coordinator of the Virtual Humanities Lab, and an affiliated professor of modern culture and media. His lecture is The New Chameleon Simulation, probably says it right there, as a paradigm for digital humanism. Now, just as background, I established this award lecture in 2013, and it was really meant to recognize members of Brown's distinguished faculty who are conducting notable and especially innovative scholarship. And recipients of the award are invited to give this lecture, and we have 2 a year. And it's an opportunity for faculty members and our students to learn about the work of their colleagues in other disciplines, and also to celebrate the wealth of extraordinary talent that we have here in the Brown faculty. And Massimo exemplifies academic leadership. He's been recognized for his research-based and innovative uses of technology in teaching, among many, many other reasons. And tonight he's going to be reflecting on his distinctive research and teaching journey as a digital humanist spanning 3.5 decades. Now, I've invited Kevin McLaughlin, professor of, do I have to say how many things you're professor of, Kevin? Kevin McLaughlin, professor of English, professor of comparative literature, and director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study, to introduce Massimo. Please join me in welcoming Kevin. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's an honor and also a pleasure to introduce the speaker of this Presidential Faculty Award lecture, Professor Massimo Riva. As a way of introducing Massimo, let me begin with a story in which he is eventually involved. Eventually. Around 2012, about a year into my service as Dean of the Faculty, I was contacted by the Mellon Foundation about a new initiative to promote digital publication in the humanities. Mellon was proposing to provide a set of deans around the country with a pool of money to distribute to faculty members as a subvention for digital publications. The idea was that the deans would make the awards to the individual faculty members completing traditional print monographs through some kind of reasonable selection process, I presume. And the faculty members would offer the subventions to their publishers for the purpose of developing digital versions of or supplements to those traditional print publications. Mellon wanted to encourage university presses to begin exploring digital scholarly publication in the humanities and the qualitative social sciences. When I finished reading this proposal from Mellon, I walked down the corridor of the first floor of University Hall to Joe Meisel's office. I think I saw Joe is here. Joe is here. Good, I'm glad you're here because you're in the story too. Joe was then serving as deputy provost, a position that he had taken on a few years earlier after a significant period of employment at the Mellon Foundation. Joe and I were in the habit in such situations of engaging in what is politely called brainstorming. I suggested to Joe the following: why should we give Mellon the money? Why don't we take the money ourselves and use it to develop digital publication at Brown? After all, Brown had a long history as a leader in electronic and new media publication, going back over several decades, in no small part thanks to colleagues like Massimo, who really has had a long history with this new media. The librarian at the time, Harriet Hamasi, was keen to develop the digital capacity at the library, as Joe reminded me. And so began a series of discussions among the three of us that led to Mellon agreeing to provide a digital scholarly publishing grant to Brown in support of the university's development of its own digital publication infrastructure. This support from Mellon, together with our very wise decision to hire Allison Levy as a digital editor. Is Allison here? No, that's too bad. To direct the initiative, And this led to what has now become Brown's University Digital Publishing Initiative. Very successful project with wonderful projects that I hope you'll go and visit on their website. But of course, the key to the success of this project lay in the quality of the Brown faculty projects that the initiative was going to be able to attract. Massimo was one of the first names that occurred to me. As his department neighbor for many years, I knew that Massimo had been a leader in exploring the relations between literature and new media, and I admired his work on the extraordinary digital Garibaldi panorama with Andy Van Dam, I believe, who's also here. And so fortunately for us, Massimo had a project. I will leave it to him to tell you more about it if he chooses to do so, or you can ask him about it later. But let me now turn to introduce him to you. Massimo Riva, as President Paxton just mentioned, is Professor of Italian Studies, coordinator of Brown's Virtual Humanities Lab, and affiliate of Modern Culture and Media. Massimo arrived at Brown University as an assistant professor in Italian Studies in 1990. He was promoted to associate professor in 1993 and professor in 2002. Massimo was awarded a Royce Professorship in Teaching Excellence, and he has served on all of the most important university committees at Brown: Academic Committee for University Planning, University Resources Committee, Tenure and Promotions Committee, Faculty Executive Committee, and the Graduate Council. He is currently, I believe, serving on the Procedural Integrity Committee as well. Massimo has also served as chair of Italian Studies for more years than he cares to remember, I suspect. Massimo's scholarship is remarkable for the way it has consistently combined traditional erudition across a wide range of fields with deep engagement in the most recent theoretical and interdisciplinary developments in literary studies, as well as in cinema and new media. This unique combination is suggested by a brief overview of some of his most important publications. After completing a doctoral dissertation on neoclassical Italian literature, Massimo went on to publish several major books, including a study of melancholy and hypochondria in 18th century Italian literary culture, a collection of essays on literary maladies and nationalism in 19th century Italian culture, an ebook on electronic literature based on original interviews with artists and critics, a collection of essays on posthumanism and the hyper-novel in the Italian philosophical and literary tradition from Pico and Vico to Calvino and Gatta. And most recently, the publication to which I just alluded, Shadow Plays, a digital monograph on optical spectacles in the 18th and the 19th centuries. Massimo's work, I dare say, has come increasingly to focus on what might be called simulation technologies, their genealogies, historical contexts and effects, and especially, it seems to me, their overlap, as is suggested by the subtitle of his digital monograph, Virtual Realities in an Analog World. This will be the topic of his remarks this afternoon, which bear the title, The New Chameleon, Simulation as a Paradigm for Digital Humanism. Please join me in welcoming our colleague Massimo Riva to the Presidential Faculty Award Lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Madam President, for this honor. And I've spent almost my entire career teaching at Brown, and this award is particularly meaningful for me. And thank you, Kevin, for that introduction, and to have thought of me since the very beginning of the Brown Digital Publications. And I want to thank also those who nominated me for this award. My presentation, you may notice a small change in the title, won't be exactly linear. Retracing my journey as a digital humanist, I'll jump back and forth between projects I've been involved in. It has been a relatively long journey, but don't worry, I have condensed it considerably for the purposes of this lecture. Our compass will be simulation as both a humanist idea and a concept related to computers and digital culture in general. First, a couple of words about the slightly modified title. The new chameleon does not refer to the recent discovery a couple of years ago of a new specimen of this fascinating species of small reptiles. And it is not a reference to the mysterious particle known as the chameleon, which, because of its ability to hide in plain sight, could be the key to understanding dark matter. Instead, it is an allusion to a text that I've chosen as an epigraph for my talk, a famous passage from the oration known as the Hominis Dignitate, on human dignity, by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, at the center of the Pico project, now part of the Virtual Humanities Lab. A collaboration among scholars based at Brown, Bologna, and other universities around the world, from Mexico to Australia, spearheaded by two now deceased and much missed Bologna colleagues, Pier Cesare Bori, a moral philosopher and the founder of the Human Rights Program at Bologna, and Dino Buzzetti, a scholar of medieval logic who became the president of the Italian Association of Computing for the Humanities. The project started in the late 1990s, facilitated by our Brown-Bologna exchange, and has resulted in several new translations and online and printed editions of Pico's work, including Spanish, Arabic, and Chinese. The oration has become a sort of manifesto of Renaissance humanism, but was actually conceived as a prologue for a truly monumental work, the Conclusiones non gente, a compilation of 900 philosophical, theological, and magical theses that, in Pico's vision, were supposed to synthesize the essence of all ancient wisdom, in short, the entire body of knowledge available to a 15th century humanist. With his 900 conclusions, the gifted and extremely wealthy young Pico, he was 23 when he wrote them, more or less the age of a Brown graduate, intended to show that all the major philosophical and theological traditions of the past, from the Greek, the Judeo-Christian, and the Islamic, to the Chaldean, the Persian, and the Hermetic traditions, converge with different languages and symbols around a system of common truths, eminently translatable from one to the other. Translating and recombining all the sources of ancient wisdom would be a way to achieve ultimate wisdom. Pico intended to publicly defend his thesis in front of an assembly of the Pope and the cardinals, and he invited scholars to come to Rome from all over Europe at his own expense. This ambitious, perhaps megalomaniac project never had a chance. Few theses were proclaimed heretical by Pope Innocent VIII. Nearly all copies of the book were burned, the first time that a printed book was banned by the church, and Pico had to flee to France, from where he could return only under the protection of his good friend Lorenzo de' Medici. The idea behind the Pico project was to relaunch via internet Pico's message emphasizing the possible convergence and concordance of all human cultures. The word concordance comes from cor, cordis, heart in Latin. Concordia is also a synonym of peace. The interface of the Pico project allowed scholars to enter their notes and commentary, and readers or users to access multiple parallel visualizations of the 1496 incunabulum of Pico's works, the transcription and the translations of the text into Italian and English, with related philological, linguistic, and interpretive annotations. The project went live in 2001, and September 11 provided a dramatic backdrop for its launch. Of course, nobody noticed it. Perhaps naively at the time, we thought that Pico's concordism could provide a model for a dialogue based on a transcultural idea of dignity, and thus serve as a bulwark against the outbreak of ideological divisions that fueled the prospect of what some called a clash of civilization. The sentence from the oration I have chosen as an epigraph for my talk compares the human being, man in most translations, to a chameleon, and to another shape-shifter, Proteus, the old man of the sea from Homer's Odyssey. The comparison has its roots in a long tradition within classical culture, to which Pico adds biblical, Kabbalistic, Pythagorean, Chaldean, and Hermetic references. I won't dwell on the intricate philological questions raised by this composite metaphor. I will focus instead on its reverberations in contemporary digital humanism. Why is the human being comparable to a chameleon? Here is Pico's answer. Se ipsum ipse in omnis carnis facem, in omnis creature ingenium effingit, fabricat et transformat. For he fashions, shapes, and transforms his own aspect, facem, into that of every flesh animal, his own mind, ingenium, into that of every creature. In short, what distinguishes our species for Pico is a mimetic, protean, and transformative nature, both physical and intellectual, both technological and symbolic. Of the three Latin verbs used by Pico, the first, effingit, is the one that fascinates me. If fabricat, literally translatable as fabricates, already implies a double meaning, building and inventing, as in fabrication, in both a technical and an artistic sense. Techne in Greek means art. And if transformat clearly emphasizes the evolving and metamorphic nature of humanity, effingit goes directly to the heart of another paradigmatic human quality or ability: to imitate, to fake, to feign, in short, to simulate. Human beings are comparable to chameleons because they simulate, fabricate, and transform their aspect into that of every living thing, their mind into that of every creature. For Pico, this simulating ability is not just a skill, it is our nature, what we essentially are, shapeless, without a fixed identity, and therefore capable of auto-fabricating. It is what, from an ethical point of view, enables us to transform ourselves into brutes or angels, because we are a true microcosm of the whole creation, as another famous passage of Pico's oration states. It is a powerful image. Indeed, this elemental protean power has exercised a constant fascination on the human mind, from alchemical treatises to Jungian psychoanalysis to the innumerable shapeshifters, superheroes, and villains disseminated in popular culture. Of course, I'm also well aware of post-humanist critiques of this optimistic praise of our human hyper-subjectivity. After all, my training in Renaissance philosophy at the University of Florence in the 1970s was crowned by a thesis on the problem of modern nihilism. Indeed, this is also the point of the considerations that follow. With a truly chameleonic leap, Pico's chameleon can be connected to our latest fabrications, the transformers that seem capable of surpassing even our capacity to simulate everything, and above all, our own capacity of transforming ourselves through learning. The new chameleon to which I allude in the title is not CM3 Leon, launched in July 2023 by Meta and defined as, quote, a single foundation model that does both text-to-image and image-to-text generation. That is, a model capable of handling and manipulating in both directions two fundamental symbolic and mimetic modes of human culture, words and images. The early examples are not exactly promising. Rather, the new chameleons is how I would characterize the full array of what we call artificial intelligence, the devices whose learning capabilities promise or threaten to surpass the transformative and creative abilities of our species, spinning the whole idea of the microcosm into another, perhaps entirely alien dimension. Foundation models could even induce us to reformulate Pico's outrageous project of synthesizing and recombining the entire body of knowledge available to 21st century humanity. I'll circle back to this preposterous idea toward the end of my talk. First, there is another meaning of simulation in the humanistic tradition that we have to consider. Let me introduce another Renaissance figure from many points of view, complementary to the theoretical and mystical Pico, Leon Battista Alberti. An engineer and a man of letters, Alberti is famous above all because he resurrected the classical architectural tradition, Vitruvius in 15th century Florence. A contemporary biographer of Alberti, here is Alberti, Cristoforo Landino, thus described Alberti's style as a writer. As a new chameleon, he always takes the color of the thing about which he writes. Indeed, Alberti himself extols the art of simulation in one of his moral dialogues. By the way, the fairly accurate translation of this passage from Latin is by ChatGPT. Alberti is writing about simulation and dissimulation as an ambivalent socio-political skill in the Ciceronian rhetorical tradition. In one of his most famous orations, Cicero calls Catiline, the ultimate conspirator, simulator ac dissimulator. Alberti's antihero is Momus, the unscrupulous and vitriolic god of criticism, and one of his inspirations is Lucian of Samosata, the ancient satirist and rhetorician. Alberti's take on simulation becomes central to Niccolò Machiavelli's famous portrait of the prince as both lion and fox. In order to seize and maintain power, the prince must be able to color truth well and to be a great simulator and dissimulator. It is not necessary for the prince to actually have all the aforementioned qualities, but it is indeed necessary to appear to have them. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Tut, were it farther off, I'll pluck it down, boasts the future Richard III in Shakespeare's play Henry VI. This is for my friend Coppelia Khan. Any reference to our current political situation is purely intentional. So this exquisitely human chameleonic ability is, of course, of great concern today. Indeed, neural networks bring simulation and dissimulation to yet another level, with potentially transformative or devastating effects. Malicious agents are everywhere, but even a benign interpretation of the chameleonic human-computer interface should give us a pause. Reading about AI chatbots, I encountered this phenomenon I'm sure you're familiar with, sycophancy, which refers to instances in which an AI model adapts responses to align with the user's view, even if the view is not objectively true. Like hallucinations, also unconscious, one assumes, for the machines, this behavior is generally undesirable and should not be encouraged, write the author of this article. Some even suggest that we should not be too polite with Alexa or Siri when we speak to them, because this encourages them to please us. Sycophancy is another questionable human behavior we risk transmitting to our machines. As Eric Brynjolfsson, director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, wrote back in 2022 in a piece significantly entitled The Turing Trap, the Promise and Peril of Human-like Artificial Intelligence, the benefits of human-like artificial intelligence include soaring productivity, increased leisure, and perhaps most profoundly, a better understanding of our own minds. But not all types of AI are human-like. In fact, many of the most powerful systems are very different from humans, and an excessive focus on developing and deploying human-like artificial intelligence can lead us into a trap, the Turing trap. I believe that the chameleon comparison, or paradigm, an example and a thought experiment, may help us make sense of human-like artificial intelligence better than other comparisons or metaphors, a stochastic parrot, for example. Recent books invite us to treat AI outputs as if they were human from an ethical point of view, and warn us that AI systems are constructed as mirrors of human intelligence, with all the flaws attached. The chameleon comparison is more effective, in my opinion, because it involves both the facium, the aspect, and the ingenium, the mind. In other words, both the interface and the algorithmic logic behind it, hidden or unconscious as it might be. In other words, it implies that simulation and dissimulation are the critical parameters by which human-like artificial intelligence should or could be understood. Modeling neural networks introduces new unforeseeable dimensions in the mimetic and adaptive game. Perhaps the test ahead boils down to this: how not to fall in the Turing trap while taking on the transformative challenge that emergent AI agents pose. In her book, The AI Mirror, Shannon Valor reminds us that AI systems project a vision of human intelligence constructed entirely from the amalgamated data of humanity's past, including the fundamental biases that are embedded in that past. Along these lines, some suggest that when it comes to humanistic data, we should be particularly wary of predictive analytics, because what predictive analytics actually predict is the past. Interestingly, recent psychological studies point at how our memory depends on, and to some extent is shaped by, its usefulness for predicting the future. Of course, AI tools can be trained on data that have little or nothing to do with human qualities or flaws, data about cosmic background radiation, or fungi, or metal fatigue, as Valor writes. But here we are primarily concerned with humanistic data, that is, data produced by humans that have shaped our multiple identities, our chameleonic heritage. Toward the end of his short life, he died at 31 in 1494, Pico left another monumental work unfinished, written under the influence of the charismatic preacher from Ferrara, an enemy of the Medici, Friar Girolamo Savonarola, a multi-volume treatise against astrology, which specifically disputed and debunked the predictive power of astrology as a deterministic faith in fakes, to use Umberto Eco's felicitous expression. Astrological predictive symbolism thwarts the exercise of our transformative free will. By the way, also astrological predictions are technically predictions of a distant past, since we now know that the light of the stars reaches us a very long time after it was emitted. Curiously, last January, Google renamed the generative artificial intelligence chatbot it developed Gemini, from the constellation, we are told, associated with the twins Castor and Pollux in Greek mythology. You see here a detail from Francesco del Cossa's astrological cycle in the Palazzo Schifanoia at Ferrara. But I believe the zodiac sign must have something to do with it. As the AI bot embedded in Google Chrome informs us, Gemini is a mutable sign. Geminis are said to be versatile, perceptive, and, quote, able to read people. AI is our digital and astrological twin. In order to make sense of the multiple chameleonic challenges that lie ahead for us, I'd like to look back at my own path. Please bear with me. In retracing my journey, I will focus on what I would retrospectively characterize as the constructionist approach that has guided my research and my research-based teaching with technology. From this point of view, simulation has a double meaning for me, epistemological and pedagogical. As modeling goes, my work has not focused on big data-driven simulations, distant reading as Franco Moretti has characterized it, but on the potentiality of simulation for what I'll call knowledge and learning design, as exemplified by this page from Joanna Drucker's seminal book, Graphises, Visual Forms of Knowledge Production. Indeed, my focus has largely been the potential evolution of the book. I came to Brown in 1990, after a stint in Australia and a couple of jobs in other American colleges. I could not have chosen a better time to join this university, or better, university college, as we used to call it. Thanks to the open curriculum in the early 1990s, Brown was a hotbed of experimentation in the liberal arts, both those of the trivium and the quadrivium. And I had the good fortune to be admitted as an apprentice sorcerer in the labs of two brilliant colleagues who became mentors and friends, the late George Landau and Robert Coover, who passed away only a few weeks ago. I'll mention in a moment my more recent collaboration with another great pioneer, right there, who has been behind transdisciplinary experimentation at Brown since the 1960s and even down. Working with George, Bob, and Andy was my gavetta, as we say in Italian. A gavetta is a mess tin, and the expression can be roughly translated as going through boot camp. Following Landau's theorization and Coover's creative interpretation of hypertext, I participated in the Brown Story Space cluster with a few experiments I conducted with my students, which included a project-based course on Italo Calvino and Umberto Eco, focused on their ideas about combinatorics, the open work, and narrative networks. Albeit formulated in the 1960s and developed in the 1990s, these ideas acquire a new meaning today, when new and much more powerful combinatorial machines are emerging that may once again transform storytelling as the real engine of human culture. More about this in my conclusions. Inspired by Landau's Victorianist web, the Decameron Web was the first project my students and I worked on. In particular, one student, Michael Papio, now a professor at UMass Amherst and a past president of the American Boccaccio Association. This project first took shape in the late 1990s, and much to my bemusement is still running today. Shaped by the availability of computer languages, HTML, XML, which enabled the first and second generation browsers, the idea behind this project was to extend both my Decameron classroom at Brown and a pedagogical method onto the much vaster playground opened up to Decameron readers by the World Wide Web. It could not have been realized without the support of the Scholarly Technology Group, predecessor of the Center for Digital Scholarship, and the support of the Friends of Italian Studies at Brown, in particular one friend sitting right there, Vinnie Buonanno. 2 major NEH grants also helped. Now, the Decameron Web can also be described as a kind of simulation. As you know, the Decameron, written in the mid-14th century against the backdrop of the Black Plague that decimated the European population, imagines that 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, escape the city ravaged by the pandemic and take refuge in a country villa, where they decide to pass time telling each other stories. 100 stories, distributed over 10 days to be precise, embedded within a multiple framing system that foreshadows our idea of hypertext. You see here an illustration from a 16th century edition of the book from our Hay Library collections. For the young narrators, this storytelling game is not just an escapist way of forgetting for a few weeks the sorrows and horrors of the pestilence, which is threatening an entire way of life, a civilization. Storytelling is also a sort of therapy in the garden, to quote the title of the book that I've been planning to write about the Decameron, and hopefully I'll be able to finish before the next pandemic. Telling each other stories, many of which have to do with the excitement and the vagaries of love, is also a way for the 10 young Florentines to prepare themselves for the eventual inevitable return to their city. It is storytelling as a testing ground for renewing the ethical foundation of social life. Finding a way back through the devastation of the plague is a labyrinthian task, an idea that resonates in the post-COVID period. The Decameron Web enables students acting in a role-playing game as the avatars of the 10 young storytellers to record their reading experience for other students to read and comment online. In other words, in its original conception, the Decameron Web was a simulation of the idea informing the book, storytelling as a community-building safe space, and extended through the internet to a worldwide community of readers, those at least who had access to a network computer. 25 years later, the renewed interest in Boccaccio's masterpiece and in our project during and in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic has convinced me that perhaps it is worth reimagining once again the book's garden setting as an immersive and interactive simulation. This is still work in progress. The simulation of the storytelling labyrinth as a half-ruined palace of memory is not meant to be a dystopian one. It rather suggests the possibility of rebuilding from the fragments of the past, a distant past that, thanks to classic works like the Decameron, can be rediscovered as an inspiration for our current endeavors and struggles. This new interface is only one aspect of our work in progress. With a small team of young researchers here at Brown, in Edinburgh, and in Modena, under the aegis of the Boccaccio Foundation in Boccaccio's birthplace near Florence, Certaldo, we are currently experimenting with another kind of simulation, enabled by the new chameleons, that reversible kind I mentioned before, capable of generating images from words and words from images, an experiment in reversible ekphrasis. Our goal is, on the one hand, to test whether the new chameleons allow us to detect previously undetected patterns in the rich historical archive of descriptions, translations, and visualizations of literary gardens. On the other, to produce or fabricate new visualizations of an aesthetically unprecedented kind, like this one. All this could perhaps lead toward an immersive 3D multilingual edition of Boccaccio's masterpiece illustrated by AI, a simulation of the book as a three-dimensional garden and a labyrinthian art gallery. The guiding principle is that emerging AI technology provides a new playground for a variety of critically controlled experiments in simulation, what I would call reversible Turing games. Let me now jump ahead to my most recent project that was mentioned before by Kevin. The digital monograph that I realized with the help of an outstanding team of designers, digital editors, and librarians with Brown Digital Publications led by Alison Levy and spearheaded by Kevin and Joe Maisel with a major grant from the Mellon Foundation. Shadow Plays is another simulation of a book, a multimodal book that tries to preserve the fundamental characteristics of the monograph, the long-form argument, which is the typical output of humanistic research, while leveraging the possibilities of digital technologies. In short, a simulation of a printed book that augments the properties of the printed page. More specifically, the digital monograph includes something that the printed book, including the lavishly illustrated and expanded Italian edition of the monograph that is about to be published, obviously could not include. Interactive 2.5 isometric models of the 18th and 19th century optical devices I focus on: the Cosmorama, the Magic Lantern, the Phantasmagoria, the Panorama, and the Stereoscope, designed to allow the reader to better understand how these devices worked. In their own time, these gadgets made possible cheap, immersive experiences, virtual travel, and what I call social voyeurism, similar to those nowadays made possible by such expensive gadgets as Apple Vision Pro, MetaQuest, and the likes. The digital monograph also includes an interactive model of the Garibaldi Panorama, an extraordinary example of 19th century popular media, and the object of another experiment in simulation I was privileged to be part of, a fascinating collaboration with Andy Van Damme and his team in the graphics lab, with our library's support. At the time, Harriet Hemessy was our university librarian, as this short video shows.
The Garibaldi Panorama is a very unique artifact because very few of these survive from the 19th century. It's a very large piece of work. It's over 273 feet long. It's painted on both sides in watercolor.
Peter Harrington, who's the curator of the Joan Hay, called me up and said, "You should come and see what we have here."
And it was a bit overwhelming at the time. I thought, well, what can we do with this? One idea behind digitizing it was to preserve it, but also to make it known to a much wider audience.
When the library scanned this, it was actually scanned in about 40 or 50 individual blocks. And then the application stitches those together into a whole. So as you scroll through, it looks like one solid piece of artwork.
And of course, the website doesn't do justice to the scale of this thing. You see this on a 12-inch by 15-inch screen, and you see it passing through.
So then what was the next step? The next step was to put it on the Microsoft Surface so that you could touch that physical object, but in a virtual way.
You can actually look at the Surface at a basic level as almost being an oversized iPhone, except for it's more than that because it uses vision technology, so you don't actually have to touch the Surface in order to interact with it.
One can actually look at the Garibaldi Panorama, move it around, touch the screen on certain panels, and see related material.
And That's really the meaning of research, and it's also the meaning of how you teach and how you learn.
Okay. So creating a simulation of the Garibaldi panorama on the Microsoft Surface also allowed us to take it around the world, something that would have been impossible or extremely expensive to do with the material object, the panorama itself. Thanks to Andy and his team, we exhibited the panorama at the British Library in London, the Italian pavilion of the International Council of Museums in Rio de Janeiro, and many venues in Italy, including the magnificent Sala del Risorgimento in the Palazzo Pubblico of Siena, and even the Italian Senate. One of the most rewarding such exhibits was at Sala Borsa, the public library in Bologna in 2011 for the 150th anniversary of Italian unification. Garibaldi, of course, is one of Italy's founding fathers. Over a month, young people in particular, like these 5th and 6th grade students, flocked to see and play with our installation. Visitors included also a few digital natives who showed a clear desire to literally immerse themselves into the historical scenes, a good test for the equipment as well. The interactive simulations of the optical tools included in my digital monograph also illustrate the argument I develop in the monograph, that modern culture has progressed from a virtualization of reality through mimetic systems disseminated in 19th century popular culture to a realization of the virtual through increasingly sophisticated technological tools that produce entirely artificial artifacts, such as so-called deepfakes, for example, or entirely artificial environments, such as the metaverse of recent elusive fortune. This realization of the virtual based on the virtualization of the real is perhaps best exemplified by our modeling in the monograph of the Egyptian tomb, a perfect facsimile of Pharaoh Seti's first burial chambers conceived and fabricated by a bizarre and brilliant Italian adventurer, Giovanni Belzoni, a strong man and mountebank celebrated by Charles Dickens, who became a pioneer archaeologist. In 1817, Belzoni excavated the actual tomb in the Valley of the Kings, near Thebes. While excavating it, he had the brilliant idea of reproducing the tomb's magnificent decorations in meticulous drawings, watercolors, and wax and plaster of Paris impressions. Back in London, he built a one-to-one scale model of the tomb and installed it at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly, complete with real mummies. Londoners flocked to see it, virtually traveling 3,000 years into the past as they entered the exhibit. As an example of Egyptomania, the tomb is a real phantasmagoria, a physical kind of immersive virtual reality, and an amazing anticipation of what we call today virtual heritage. You see here, side by side, a video of the photogrammetric reproduction of the actual tomb realized by Fattumarte Foundation and the University of Basel, and a video of our simulation of Belzoni's exhibit. Our interactive digital model uses digital facsimiles of Belzoni's drawings and watercolors and contemporary accounts by Londoners who visited the tomb. In short, it is a contribution to a cultural history of virtual heritage. It is also, technically, a simulation of a simulation. Speaking of mummies and virtual heritage, in the news these days are discoveries made through ancient DNA analysis about the so-called mummies of Pompeii. These famous casts of corpses buried by volcanic ash during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD were physical simulations made by archaeologists who filled the cavities with plaster to create replicas of the victims' death throes. As a recent article in the New York Times explores, the narratives spun around the more evocative casts turn out to be mostly inventions, family groups whose DNA analysis reveals to be unrelated, for example. Even physical simulations can be fabrications. In the last chapter and simulation of my digital monograph focused on stereoscopic vision, I take the mummies of Pompeii as an example of how the threshold between the visible and the invisible, what is there and what is not, what is in full light and what hides in the shadows, is very thin and often blurred. indeed a matter of perception, since perception is always consciously or unconsciously influenced by our imagination, our cultural prejudices, and the cognitive mold of our minds. If Egyptian mummies are about the preservation of our frail bodies for the afterlife, the mummies of Pompeii are a visible simulation of the trace and the void our bodies leave on this earth. Our simulation illustrates how stereoscopic vision made the mummies of Pompeii three-dimensionally tangible for late 19th century virtual travelers. As the example of the Pompeii mummies demonstrates, visually reconstructing the past is unreliable and sometimes fanciful. Yet simulation can be also a powerful cognitive tool. This is the fundamental idea behind the course that Fulvio Domini and I have designed and taught for 3 semesters, thanks to a very generous collaborative grant from the Kogut Institute. In this course, the humanistic idea of simulation, in Pico's sense, invention, fabrication, transformation, intersects the experimental method. As an experimental psychologist, Fulvio studies 3D perception in his lab. For example, we looked at historic optical experiments such as Filippo Brunelleschi's 15th century modeling of the Battistero in Florence, which is at the origins of the long history of linear perspective, first codified by Leon Battista Alberti in his writings as both a mimetic tool and a symbolic form. With an ingenious apparatus of his own invention, Brunelleschi drew a sketch, a virtual 2.5 isometric model of the Battistero, using a system of mirrors and trigonometric calculations, an experiment reverse-engineered by the British artist David Hockney to support his idea of a secret experimental knowledge behind the lost techniques of the old masters. Students in our course were guided to reverse-engineer similar experiments in digital format, or conceive and design their own experiments, combining, in their simulations, methodologies belonging to the humanistic realm, such as digital humanities and media archaeology, and lab-based experimental methods. Ironically, the first time we taught it, in spring 2020, this class became itself an experiment in simulation. Because of COVID, we switched to remote in the middle of the semester. But students nevertheless came up with timely and poignant experiments, such as, for example, transforming the bedroom they were confined to into an immersive camera obscura that longingly reflected the shadows of the world outside, as in this photograph by Cuban artist Abelardo Morel. The fundamental lesson our students hopefully drew from our course is that simulating the past is also a way of reinventing it with our technological means, keeping it alive as an engine for the future. And this is the specific inspiration that Renaissance humanism at its best still offers us. Of course, we should never believe that our simulations are a substitute for reality, the material objects and the social relationships that make human culture meaningful, or indulge in the hallucinatory thought that we may actually be living in a simulation, because otherwise we may end up in one, or worse, end up in Kafka's penal colony. This leads me to the last section of my talk. Over the 34.5 years I have spent teaching at this university, the meaning of learning has radically changed. My personal journey as a digital humanist that I have sketchily retraced for you is just a small example of how a scholar and teacher of Italian studies could adapt to and to some extent embrace this transformation. Now, it is precisely on the meaning of learning that the new chameleons challenge us. And this challenge is not limited to human-like artificial intelligence, but is definitely crucial for a human-centered artificial intelligence. The simulative Turing games we play with our machines are becoming ever more enticing and insidious for us. The stakes could be boiled down to this simple choice. Should we try to avoid at all costs the Turing trap? Or should we, on the contrary, dive right into it in order to make sense of it? I'm aware that this is a gross simplification of a much more complicated and fraught relationship, but I'm convinced that the chameleonic paradigm can help us grasp what is at stake in the reverse modeling we have embarked on with deep neural networks, autoencoders, AI-powered robotics, and the likes. Interestingly, Alan Turing himself, in the last part of his life, was concerned with the realization of machines capable of learning, evolution, growth, self-organization, and interaction with the environment. Turing's trajectory from the problem of computability and decision in relation to mathematical models to simulation of intelligent behavior through self-correcting algorithms, such as backpropagation algorithms, for example, to the organization of life forms, is consistent with an idea of knowledge as the ability to adapt to and learn from an external environment and other agents, to imitate, fabricate, and transform. In his 2019 novel, Machines Like Us, the writer Ian McEwan has imagined what ethical and emotional dilemmas our android twins could present us had Turing lived on to continue his work. Now, if Pico, Alberti, and Turing are right, simulation is still a paradigmatic mode of knowledge for our species, whether it presents itself in fictional or analytical form, in linguistic or mathematical science, in abstract calculations or aesthetic visualizations. Only by deepening our critical understanding of this cognitive double bind can we make the most of our simulating power as we transfer it to our machines. As a digital humanist, I am less concerned about the learning and adaptive abilities of machines and more about our learning, our ongoing adaptation as a microcosm in inevitable co-evolution with all the animals, all the creatures, our whole planet as a living organism. And yes, in coevolution with our own latest fabrication, the thinking machines we are building and playing with. Trust the unfathomable combinatorial and predictive power of machines and let it guide us, or harness the machine's power and use it to test our own self-knowledge. Another gross simplification, admittedly. These are not our only choices. There is an entire realm of possibilities between them. Moreover, as I mentioned a moment ago, these two choices are actually tied to each other in a cybernetic loop and a double bind. A visionary Italian writer I have already mentioned, Italo Calvino, toyed with the second choice in the 1960s and 1970s, using machines, computers, to test storytelling as perhaps the fundamental dimension of our self-knowledge. An acolyte of the French avant-garde group Oulipo, acronym for Workshop of Potential Literature, in his storytelling, from the cosmic comics, whose protagonists are atoms, cells, fossils, and mathematical entities, to the combinatorial narratives of the Castle of the Crossed Destinies, Invisible Cities, and If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, Calvino pursued an idea he set forth in a seminal 1967 essay entitled Cybernetics and Ghosts. So mummies and ghosts now. In short, the literary machine envisioned by Calvino, a writing machine that would bring to the page all those things that we are accustomed to consider as the most jealously guarded attributes of our psychological life, of our daily experience, etc., is a perfectly humanized, if uncanny, twin or double of ourselves, not necessarily sentient or conscious, but capable of simulating our most cherished gift, our creativity, and perhaps even surpassing our ability to learn by simulating everything. The new chameleons, LLMs and foundation models, etc., are still a rudimentary but much more powerful version of this machine imagined by Calvino. Indeed, speaking of a literary machine, it is now possible to envision a narrative equivalent of AlphaFold, the DeepMind tool that designs new protein structures from a large dataset of existing ones. Calvino would have liked this idea. In fact, he would have probably used it for a sequel of his cosmic comics. 20 years ago, in my class on Calvino and Eco and the future of storytelling, inspired by my apprenticeship in Bob Coover's hypertext lab, students designed hypertext using the imaging systems available to them. One of these students, a neuroscience and literature double concentrator, had the brilliant idea of mapping Calvino's unfinished stories about the five senses collected in a posthumously published book entitled Under the Jaguar Sun onto a visualization of neuronal pathways, the image on the left. In her hypertext, reading a line and firing the neurons were two specular operations, two cybernetic sides of a single meaning-producing process.
Her mapping could even offer some rhizomatic paths for a potential completion of the stories left unfinished by Calvino's premature death. Interestingly, Calvino saw the potential artistic output of the machine as a kind of hyperclassicism, if classicism can be defined as a rigorous application of fundamental rules of harmony or symmetry. Now, with the deep neural learning, these rules might soon become incomprehensible to us, even if they are based on a recombination of our human cultural archive, including avant-garde variations, as in this case. The emergence of machines, not just learning from each other, but entertaining each other with literary simulation or artistic visualization, would be a clear sign that we humans are becoming obsolete. Literature is a combinatorial game that pursues the possibilities implicit in its own material. Calvino also wrote in Cybernetics and Ghosts. But it is a game that at a certain point is invested with an unexpected meaning, a meaning that is not patent on the linguistic plane on which we were working, but has slipped in from another level, activating something that on that second level is of great concern to the author or his society. Calvino's idea of an unexpected behavior or meaning parallels the concept of emergence in AI, which, as noted in the 2022 Stanford report on foundation models, occurs when AI systems developed unexpected capabilities from the collective functioning of their algorithms and data structures. Whether this is a sign of intelligence is, of course, debatable. As we contemplate the possibility of fabricating, with the help of the new chameleons, simulations of everything, perhaps even a model of all models, to quote the title of another Calvino story, perhaps a predictive psychohistorical model based on Isaac Asimov's Encyclopedia Galactica, including a simulation of ourselves, a microcosmic simulation of all possible simulations that would make Pico's Kabbalistic conclusiones pale in comparison, we should be well aware of the new meaning of Calvino's unexpected meaning. Slipping in from another level, or sprung out of a mysterious fold of our chameleonic intellect, ingenium, neurons fired up by something else that reshape, realign, transform our cognitive abilities. Is this something else uncomputable? Anything that is outside discrete rationality, to quote Alexander Galloway? Or does it point to a kind of non-conscious cognition, as Nancy Catherine Hales suggested a few years ago? Whatever we call them, strange as they are, these unpredictable thoughts, hallucinations, or dreams are not exclusively our own anymore, as they may proceed not just from a flaw in predictive analytics and the data powering it, but from an emergent algorithmic non-conscious cognition. In short, we may now begin to share also our unconscious with our digital twins. Last slide. Inspired by an ancient atomist, the poet Lucretius, a master of metamorphosis, the poet Ovid, and the Eulipian writer Georges Perec, Calvino called this unexpected emergence a swerve, clinamen, in Lucretius Latin. Faithful to Calvino, we could compare the swerve to an evolutionary leap or a quantum leap of the imagination. This is all very exciting, but literature, as a bottomless repository of human intelligence and wisdom, offers us another cautionary tale. In the Odyssey, Menelaus tells Telemachus, who is searching for his father Ulysses, about his own struggle with shifting Proteus, as Ovid called the old man of the sea. If you can snare him and hold him tight, Proteus' daughter Eidothea, who fancies the Greek, warns him, he will tell you about your voyage, what courses you are to take, and how you are to sail the sea so as to reach your home. If, like Menelaus, we can snare our new chameleons and hold them tight, we may be able to shape our own destiny, or at least become more aware of it. Yet, as a final cautionary thought about the chameleonic challenge we are facing, I will end by quoting the scholar Michel Pastoureau, who studies the history of colors, and who makes us aware of a simple evolutionary fact and riddle. A chameleon, he writes, shows its true color only when it touches another chameleon. As we face the new chameleon, a creature of our own making, perhaps this riddle encapsulates for us the ultimate wisdom Pico was after, the wisdom of simulation as the way we understand and shape or remake everything we touch, remaking ourselves in the process. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions.
You have to show your chameleonic colors. Maybe we should. Oh, there's towels.
Thank you very much for this, Massimo. I was struck early on in the discussion of Pico and concerns about, or the discussion of the chameleon there was making me think of Jennifer Herbst's work on putting on virtue and sort of the concern in the early modern context. Thank you. The concern in the early modern context with imitation and fashioning oneself in ways that, she's concerned about how that ties to Augustine's critique of classical virtues and so forth. But it ends up in her work, and we might think of turning to concerns about authenticity over against being a chameleon, fashioning or putting on virtue in that way. And I just wondered, thinking about the contemporary context, whether any sort of notion of authenticity is even intelligible or a meaningful concept, and if so, if it's in any way useful.
Well, that's a big question. I think that probably our new chameleons are better equipped to answer. I'm not joking. I think, of course, in the Italian tradition, the whole idea of self-fashioning and shaping your own identity, etc., is the foundation of an entire, intellectual as well as literary, ideal. Started with Baldassare Castiglione and so on and so forth in the early 16th century. Today, I think the pursuit of authenticity is really, I believe, impossible. I think that we have to accept, this is my opinion, of course, accept that old-fashioned idea and with all the sophisticated knowledge that was built upon that fundamental idea, Leon Battista Alberti, etc., that we cannot find a core of authenticity in ourselves. So that's actually, I might be, risking, attractive. But I think, it's very important to have that awareness and self-awareness in order to tackle this. And of course, this impinges upon identity and all. If we talk about identity, I think authenticity and identity are really two different things. I think the pursuit of identity or the preservation and reinvention of a cultural identity not necessarily is the same thing as a pursuit of authenticity, or at least I don't see it that way, but could be done also through self-fashioning, which is another way of saying through learning. There is a question from... One more. Scott gave his voice, like Michel, with a simulation of the Egyptian tomb, because
That's true, I did.
English-speaking.
Yeah, so...
play the sound, but your voices are narrating the tomb. So.
This also might be quite a tricky question, but I was really struck in the talk that AI is predicting the past is such a powerful and fascinating paradox. And I wonder what then what difference that makes when we have a machine that's predicting the past, as it were, what difference that makes to the future. In other words, I've been thinking a lot about prophecy recently, in the way that a prophecy makes it brings into being the thing that it prophesizes, right? Unless by the uttering of the prophecy, the events that are prophesized are then set into motion. So it's only because Odysseus is trying to avoid the things that he's predicted that will happen, that they happen, or his parents, or Macbeth. And so I'm wondering, on that model, what difference it makes when you have AI predicting the past, like how we then understand that paradox. It does also then alter our future in a way when we have this strange notion that prediction is no longer doing what it seems to be doing. It's no longer doing the thing that it announces itself as doing, and it's doing something else instead. So I'm wondering, I guess it's just if you could talk a little bit more about that paradox, it'd be really, really interesting.
It is a paradox, and in fact, I think it comes down to not trusting blindly the predictive power, of course, of these tools that we build, but also about deciding, decision, what those prophecies of the past can tell us about our own attitude and challenges towards the future. So I think it probably is how to maintain control, and thinking through the paradox is the only way I see as a recipe for dealing with this, because it is a paradox. It is a paradox. But in a sense, when Calvino says that all the unexpected meaning comes out of just recombining, our knowledge and our, even our, cultural past as such, I think that's already a parallel there that is quite interesting. So we can humanize the machine or dehumanize us in the process. That's the real challenge, in terms of when we tackle that kind of, prophetic power of the machines, which clearly is an illusion, a simulation. So being aware that it is an illusion, a simulation, or a simulation better than illusion, allows us to exercise some critical thinking about the prophetic element, which is nevertheless a very important part of human culture. From astrology, the parallel between astrology and predictive analytics is not just a flight of fancy. It's really, I think, quite on target, because it really targets the way that we are always looking at the past in order to plan for the future or to anticipate the future, etc. And I'm not a psychologist, maybe Fulvio can help me with that, but the psychological studies about the structure of memory and how memory works and selective memory in order to, could be a fascinating way of bringing it back to our own, constitution, yes. I think, yes. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, please, again.
Please join us for a reception outside, and we can talk some more.